Hey everyone, my name is Dave, and we're going to begin our lecture here on conscription and World War I. So, share the screen. And here we go. Go die for your own empire. Quebec and World War I. Okay, so here's the thing. From the very first days of Confederation, French Canadians had been concerned that they would be drafted to fight in Britain's colonial wars. Pro-Confederation French Canadians like Georges-Étienne Cartier and had assured the population that that wouldn't happen, and that the only way that French Canadian soldiers would be forced to pick up guns was that if Canada herself were under attack. This is not what happened. Empire means war. And the bigger the empire, the more wars you're going to have to fight to preserve it. The idea that a quarter of Canadians could be exempt from fighting for that empire was reasonable so long as the conflicts were low level and out in the colonies. But once it expanded into total war, it would require all of Canada's manpower, and it would get it. So before World War I, Britain's most destructive colonial war was the Boer War, which was fought in South Africa between the British on one end and Dutch and Huguenot settlers called the Boers on the other. It started in 1899. Once it was clear that the war would be long, Britain appealed to aid from its colonies. So this is exactly as French Canadian politicians had feared with Confederation, all right, that Canada would become entangled in British imperial adventures, and French Canadians would be sent off to fight for an empire they neither wanted nor felt to be a part of. So here's an example of a recruiting posters at the time, and you'll notice here on the one with the lady, the British, I guess I was going to say Lady Liberty, but that's not right. British goddess of whatever. She's surrounded by troops from the empire. You'll see a guy with a turban there and guys with hats that you'd wear in Australia and so on. The prime minister at the time was Wilfrid Laurier, Canada's first French Canadian prime minister. And his whole political career, Laurier was torn between his French Canadian Catholic roots and the fact that he had to govern a country that was largely made up of Anglo-Protestants. When the Boer War began, Britain did ask Canada for troops, and the opposition Conservatives insisted that they send 8,000 soldiers right away. The Liberals initially consented to just sending 1,100, but the war heated up, and in the end, 7,200 Canadian soldiers were sent to fight in South Africa. Now, of those 7,200 soldiers, only 3% were French. By the time the war ended in 1902, 224 Canadians died and 252 had been wounded. So in general, English Canada mightily supported the war and French Canada mightily opposed it. We're still talking about the Boer War here. This proved to be a testing ground for a new Quebec politician, Henri Bourassa, or Henry Bourassa in English. Bourassa was born in 1868 in Montreal. He is the grandson of Louis-Joseph Papineau, whom you might remember led the the rebellion of 1837. In 1896, he was elected to Ottawa as the Liberal representative for Laval and formed part of Laurier's Liberal majority government. But Bourassa could not stomach the Boer War. And he would make his mark over the next half century opposing Canada's participation in foreign British-led wars, especially if they involved conscription. When Laurier agreed to send troops to South Africa, Bourassa accused him of being a sellout. He quit Laurier's government, he resigned as MP, and he was then re-elected as an independent with a huge majority. Bourassa was not a separatist, and he insisted his nationalism encompassed all of Canada and not just Quebec. But it was the nationalism of an independent independent Canada. one that was no longer at the beck and call of the British Crown. Bourassa despised the South African War because it was a turn in the wrong direction. It was away from independence and toward further integration into the empire. More importantly, it created a future precedent that could lead Canada into more foreign wars. It's also worth mentioning Bourassa would go on to become the publisher of Le Devoir, the major French newspaper in Montreal. So, the First World War. When the First World War began in 1914, almost everyone supported it, including Bourassa. Lines of men volunteered to fight, but eventually those sources dried up in the butchery of the Western Front. And so people started talking about conscription. Conscription, the practice of forcing young people, usually men, in this case men, to serve in the military, is never popular, and it's usually actively hated. Many immigrants had come to Canada to escape conscription, especially in places like Russia, in Germany, in Austria-Hungary. Now, there was no talk of conscription when the war began. Everyone said it's going to be a volunteer army. After supporting the war in its early days, though, Henry Bourassa turned around and declared it a foreign war that Canada had no business fighting. It was Britain's war, it was France's war, it was Europe's war. So, I mean, did we owe them anything? Okay, well, yeah, we owe them loyalty, all right? But we don't owe them military service, all right? Now, there are no clear numbers for exactly how many French Canadian soldiers enlisted compared with English Canadians, but it's clear that Anglophone soldiers far outnumbered French soldiers. So in 1917, Parliament gave it its best guess. About 14,100 soldiers and officers were French. You can compare that with 125,245 English Canadians, and 155,095 British subjects who were born outside of Canada, almost certainly in England. So to English Canada, it was clear that Quebec was not doing its job of sending enough fresh meat to the European abattoir. It didn't help that the cause that an anti-Catholic Protestant clergyman was put in charge of recruiting in Quebec, kind of dumb, the Minister of Militia, Stan Hughes. So Wilfrid Laurier now is the leader of the opposition, and Robert Borden's Conservatives are the government. So Wilfrid Laurier was attacked, right? He was saying, you're insufficiently hawkish, you're not supporting the war enough. Henry Bourassa was vilified in the English media as a radical, as a pro-German agitator. And Bourassa in turn attacked the British, accusing Britain of rape, of cupidity, of tyranny, of being a jingoistic empire that was bleeding Canada dry. These views, to many English Canadians and even some French ones, were just treason. Other French Canadians, like Bourassa's cousin, Talbot Papineau, supported the war, saying it would truly create the Canadian nation, as soldiers lived and died side by side. Meanwhile, the Catholic hierarchy of Quebec, which is very important when it comes to French public opinion, they were pretty lukewarm about the whole business. So here are just a few recruitment posters that were put up in Quebec. So the first one here, with the guy surrounded by the Union Jacks, says, we will defend our precious joyau de la liberté, the nugget of liberty. So will you join us to crush tyranny? And then the other one says, French Canadians enroll in the 150th Mont Royal Riflemen. And they notice that it says sous le commandement de Lieutenant Colonel Barret. So it's under the command of this guy Barret. I don't know who he is, but he's French. So they kind of mention the fact that, yeah, you will be serving underneath other French people, which meant something, right? Okay. So for many English Canadians, if French Canada did not want to fight, then it had to be forced to. With conscription. So throughout Canada, militarists argued that not only did volunteerism let the lazy and the cowardly avoid service, but it took all the best men, the brave, the adventurous, the hardworking, the Christian, and killed them, leaving the country to the cowards. Further voluntary schemes, including voluntary national registration and raising brigades for home defense, failed. Meanwhile, casualties in Europe rose. In the first half of 1917, Canada lost more than 30,000 men dead, including at the Great Victory at Vimy. So these men, of course, had to be replaced. No, wait, that's where we want to be. At the beginning of 1917, Canadian PM Robert Borden sails to England to consult with the Imperial War Cabinet in London. And he got a very clear message from the British government: send more men. Borden had been unaware how badly the war had been going in Europe, and the mood in England at the time was gloomy and pessimistic. There was a serious chance the Allies could lose the war, especially as revolution rocked Russia and France faced mutinies from its own soldiers. By the time Borden had returned to Canada in mid-May, his mind was made up. Canada would introduce conscription. Borden's cabinet all agreed, even his two French cabinet ministers. On the 18th of May, 1917, Borden announced his decision to the House of Commons, to wild cheers from the Conservative benches and stunned silence from the Liberal benches. Arthur Mahan, Borden's Solicitor General and a future Prime Minister of Canada, drafted the Military Service Act. So this was the main law for conscription. It was introduced in Parliament on June 11th and provided that all male British subjects between the ages of 20 and 45 should be liable for military service. Now, remember here, there was no Canadian citizenship at the time. You were either British or you were something else, but there was no Canadian citizen. The nation's manpower was divided into classes based on age and civil status. These classes would be called for service as required. Now, there were exemptions. There were exemptions for men engaged in war industries, for the specially qualified, and for conscientious objectors. On the 24th of July, the bill passed thanks to a large Conservative majority, but several English-speaking Liberals also supported it. That said, every French-Canadian Liberal opposed it. And the night the motion passed, there was a major riot in Montreal and one person died. So at this, Borden saw his chance, and this is where we see the very cunning and ruthless politician that Robert Borden was. He offered the Liberals a coalition government, what he called a unity government, of Conservatives and Liberals who would be dedicated to one purpose, and that is winning the war. There was an election scheduled for December, and there was really only one issue, which was conscription. The Conservatives or the Union wanted it. The Liberals did not want it, conscription. So, and though the Union would likely have won anyway, the Conservatives fixed it. So, the first thing the Conservatives or the Union government did was pass two bills, the Military Voters Act and the Wartime Electors Act. So the first bill, the Military Voters Act, gave every soldier in Canadian uniform the right to vote, no matter how long they had spent in Canada or how old they were or whatever. A soldier could vote in any riding he wished, or he could just vote government or opposition, and the army would just assign the vote to any riding they wished. So as you can guess, this led to all kinds of cheating, right? As Union votes were just they were just sent to ridings that needed them. It was assumed that most soldiers would vote Union, since conscription held out the possibility that they would be relieved, or at least that the war would end more quickly. Some officers plainly told their men how to vote, and some officers just marked their ballots for them. The second bill was the Wartime Electors Act, and this bill enfranchised, for the first time, Canadian women to vote in federal elections. But there was a catch. You had to be the mother, wife, sister, or daughter of a serving Canadian soldier. Now, the assumption here was that these women would vote for the Union government, and therefore conscription, in order to bring their men home earlier. And that's exactly what happened. About 500,000 women voted in federal elections for the first time, and 70% of them voted Union. Meanwhile, that same bill stripped enemy aliens, quote unquote, of their right to vote. Any immigrant from an enemy country who had arrived in Canada after 1902 was stripped of his right to vote, even if he was a British subject at this time. So this obviously included Germans, Austrians, Turks, and Bulgarians, the enemy in the war. But it also includes slews of other peoples, like Poles and Ukrainians, many of whom had little love for the governments that they had earlier fled. As a liberal put it before the election, the government chose the voters instead of the voters choosing the government. Now, the other trick Borden used was whipping up anti-French hatred, all right? Before the election, Borden and most distinguished Central Canadians resisted outright racism against the French. But this changed with the election. And what was previously just sort of a disdain for the French became a walloping war cry of racist hate. Okay, so this is similar to how Donald Trump went after Mexicans in 2016. Borden went after French Canadians. Union government pamphlets said that if Laurier wins, quote, the French Canadians who have shirked their duty in this war will be the dominating force in the government of the country. Are the English-speaking people ready to stand for that? End quote. Repeatedly, Union politicians and propaganda told English Canadians that a vote for Laurier was a vote for Quebec, and a vote for Quebec was a vote for surrender. There was no mealy-mouthed wondering about good French or bad French or anything like that. The slogan, Quebec shall not dominate the rest of Canada, became a Union rallying cry. The message was clear to English Canada. Quebec has betrayed you. Vote Union, and Quebec will be cut down to its rightful place, and its sons will be forced to participate in the war that they have shirked for so long. So what happens? Well, the result was the Union government soundly thrashed the Liberals, 153 seats for the Union and 82 for Laurier's Liberals. Almost all the Liberal seats were in Quebec, where it was Borden who was thrashed, only winning 3 Anglo seats in Montreal. The country was totally divided. An overwhelming number of English Canadians had voted for the Union and therefore conscription. An overwhelming number of French Canadians had voted for the Liberals and therefore against conscription. But there are more English than French in Canada, and so the government strategy worked. Rarely has there been a more hostile, racist, or divisive election in Canadian history. At least I certainly can't think. So here are a few ads, right, that were put out by the Union government. So you got here, Quebec must not rule all Canada. And you've got sort of a stereotypical of a French Canadian habitant cutting down the national maple. And you see on the branches, it says the Military Service Act, National Union, and so on. And then over here, you've got the slacker must not rule Canada, vote for the Union government. And then Borden's bill brings out the slacker and leaves your brother at home. I find actually that one to be the most telling, because it's saying that, we'll leave your brother at home, he's cool, and we'll send a slacker instead, which kind of means sending a French person. So, although I guess there's many ways of interpreting it. So now it was time to introduce conscription. How did it go? It went badly. Part of winning the election in English Canada involved reassuring Canadians that it actually wouldn't be their sons going to war, especially the sons of farmers who were enjoying a huge wartime boom and anyway were essential to providing food for the military, for England, and for Canada. This meant lots of exemptions. You could apply for an exemption on several grounds, and many of them were very loosely defined. You could apply for an exemption if you had an essential occupation, if your work required special qualifications, if serious hardship would befall your family, if you were a conscientious objector, a Mennonite, a Doukhobor, a clergyman, an honorably discharged veteran, or if you had an obvious physical disability. like the loss of a limb or an eye or something like that. If someone wanted to be exempted, he had to apply and make his own case to a local tribunal. If the tribunal refused your exemption, you could appeal to the courts and to all their appeal procedures, which is not exactly the speediest way of getting men in uniform, though the tribunals tried to move as fast as possible. So the result was that nearly every man in uniform, every man who was drafted asked for an exception. All right. In Montreal, 93% of men asked for an exemption. In Hull, it was 99% of men. And surprise, surprise, it was similar in English Canada. In Toronto, 96% of men requested an exemption. In Vancouver, it was 70%. Calgary, 86%. So clearly, this wasn't just an issue of French Canadians not wanting to fight. Nobody wanted to fight anymore. By November 10th, the cutoff date for reporting, 332,000 men had been processed. Of that number, 24,000 did not seek an exemption, a level of 7.3% across Canada. By the end of 1917, 73% of exemptions were granted by the tribunals, and that does not include appeals to the courts. Another big problem in Quebec was the military authorities received very little help from the local police in rounding up defaulters. So back in Europe, on March 21st, 1918, the German army broke through the lines on the Western Front, making 3 miles in one day and many more miles in the weeks after that. So the Canadian soldiers were in a fairly quiet quarter of the line, but for most of the remaining allies, Russia had withdrawn following the communist revolution. Defeat seemed to be at hand. People really thought this was it. We're gonna lose. Borden told his war cabinet and the military to get it into gear and to get him some more men. He pressed the courts in Quebec to work faster. The pressure exploded in Quebec City over the Easter weekend, March 28th to April 1st, as anti-conscription riots rocked the city. 4 civilians were killed by a Toronto army unit, which, as far as many French were concerned, was an occupation force. The jails were packed, habeas corpus and other civil rights were suspended. Anyone found to have been participating in the riot was immediately drafted. But the rioters' message was clear. Quebec was not going to accept forced military service, whatever the hell was going on in Europe or whatever the government said. So over here, we got a newspaper in French, La Patrie, and the headline reads, Les émeutes de Québec, the Quebec riots, okay? And then over here, you've got 5 morts, 5 dead. Later, they would figure out it was actually only 4. On April 12th, the government canceled all the exemptions, right? It prohibited future exemptions for young single men, and it called up every man between 20 and 24 for immediate service. The bill was rammed through Parliament, met with fierce opposition, not just from Quebec, but from farmers across the country who had been repeatedly told that their sons would not be drafted. That spring and summer, men were mustered from all over the country. Fortunately, the German advance had been turned around. American conscripts were pouring into Europe, and Allied soldiers were now marching toward Berlin. Allied victory seemed finally within reach. The draft, meanwhile, remained totally disorganized. Very few conscripts made it to England, and none of them saw combat before the war ended on November 11th, 1918. The whole exercise had been futile and worthless. And it would not be forgotten, okay? Especially 25 years later, when the whole debacle repeated itself again in the Second World War. So, thanks a lot.